In recent years, a number of major global players in agribusiness, as well as an international consultancy, became commercial partners of the network. For details, you can see agribenchmark.org. Beyond these management capabilities, Yelto has a track record in analyzing major trends in global crop production and disseminating reliable information for decision makers. His most recent work focuses on competitiveness of EU isoglucose versus sugar, the economics of specialty crops in Kazakhstan, and strength and weaknesses of Russian grain production. He was supervisor of a research project on the competitiveness of agro-holdings in the Ukraine and on the economic perspectives of rice production in Southeast Asia and Africa, funded by FAO and GIZ, respectively. He also holds a PhD in agricultural economics from the University of Göttingen. It's my second German word of the conference. He is a member of the editorial board of the International Journal of Agricultural Management. Please join me in welcoming Yelto to the stage.
Yeah, Heather, thank you so much for this very kind introduction. I would like to thank you also for inviting me here and give me the opportunity to present to the audience this afternoon. When I first saw the agenda, I thought I had like two conflicting thoughts, because we have two sayings in German which basically go, the last one gets bitten by the dogs. I don't know whether you have something similar. But there's also one other saying which goes, the best comes at the end. And I will do my very best to stick to the latter of the two thoughts which I had, but hopefully you can judge that afterwards. So coming to the presentation, I have structured my presentation as follows. I will briefly introduce you to the AgriBenchmark concept. What is that all about? I will then focus more particular on canola production and look how Canadian canola production compares, as Heather indicated. And then I will do the very same for wheat, because also wheat is, of course, a very important crop to Canadian crop production. And then I have a short look at Argentina. There's an elephant in the room, future wheat production in Argentina. So what is AgriBenchmark all about? We have a motto which says, let's grow together, understanding agriculture worldwide. And our desire is to help manage challenges in global agriculture. And that is true not only for institutions as mentioned, FAO or GIZ, which then obviously is very much focusing on developing countries, but also for all kinds of stakeholders like big agriculture companies like John Deere or Bayer or so forth. And then we also say learn local, grow global. We think in order to manage those challenges, it's important to have reliable and comparable data on farming systems to understand the dynamics of farming systems. Because we think it's no longer enough to have just big numbers crushing, but rather to understand the dynamics and the logic of production systems in order to be able to also talk about future developments. And another feature which we think is very important, we compare apples to apples. What do I mean by that? So if I would ask you to come up with some figures on cost of production data for, let's say, US and Canada, it will probably take you, I don't know, half an hour or something like that to grab that from the internet. But the big problem will be that the way this data has been generated and presented will not be comparable. So that means you will not ending up comparing apples to apples, but comparing apples to pies. Peers, sorry. And therefore, we have developed a uniform database and a uniform system to collect those data. I will present the details afterwards, but that's one of our key features. And the last, but probably also very important claim we have, we dig deeper. That means, as I just said, you will be very easily able to generate some data on cost of production, but most of the time you will only get some figures for, let's say, fertilizer expenditure. But you will, in most of the times, not be able to find what quantities have been associated with that, and how does it spread between nitrogen, phosphate, and potash. But in order to understand a production system and also to understand how it reacts to external changes, it's really important to understand the quantities, because high expenditure for fertilizers can be the result of heavy use of fertilizers, or because of the domestic prices are very high for whatever reasons that might have. So therefore, we have a complete set of production system data covering all physical data and also all associated economic data. Yeah, and the key idea of the whole network is that we don't do that ourselves, traveling around the world, but rather we partner with institutions around the world. And these are the European partners we have on board. These are the ones we work with in North America. Maybe just a question. I guess all the audience will have access to the presentation anyhow, so I don't want to go to the details here. And these are the partners we do have in South America, in Asia, in Africa, and in Australia. And if you have a closer look at this, you will realize that this is quite a variety of partners, ranging from research institutions like the Turin Institute, where I originally come from, to universities, but also all kind of consultancy businesses or even farm management business. And the key criteria for us is really, is this institution interested in doing hands-on farm production system oriented research or not? That is key for us in selecting partners. A few words on Canadian AgriBenchmark network. We used to have, since the very beginning, a cooperation with Dick Shoney from Saskatchewan, but recently we have been able to expand our network into Ontario and Manitoba. As of now, we have existing partnerships, as I said, with Saskatchewan, with Ontario, with John Molenhuis from Omafra. In Manitoba, we work with Yelto Zimmer. And in total, we have like 6 typical farms. And thanks to a cooperation between FMC and ourselves, we will have the opportunity to broaden this network, working towards representativity, so being able to say for all the major natural and economic framework conditions to be able to make a statement about how those farms perform and how they compare. But also we have committed ourselves together with FMC to improve and strengthen the cooperation between Canadian partners and to initiate tailored research on issues impacting Canadian crop producers and their stakeholders. And we think it's important both for domestic comparisons, but also for global benchmarks. And the overall goal for this cooperation is to enable growers in Canada to put their strategic planning into a global perspective. And I hope my subsequent presentation will feed into that goal. Yeah, just a few words about this fuzzy word, typical farms. When we talk about typical farm, we say the first thing is it should represent the origin of a major share of the national output, or in terms of Canada, I should say of the provincial output. So where are the hotspots of, let's say, wheat production in Alberta? Alberta will be the first question which we will be answering, putting forward. It's defined by what we call a production system and a combination of enterprises. You may know that in many parts of the world, crop production is done in combination with livestock operations, which has then a number of economic consequences, of course, whereas in other parts of the world, we have more specialized farms, ones which are looking at crop production as well, which are only looking at crop production. And then a typical farm has a number of structural features regarding ownership of land as well as labor organization. Again, you may know that especially in countries like Russia and Ukraine, 90% of the crop production takes place in commercial operations where all the labor input is purchased, so hired labor, whereas most parts of the rest of the world, I would argue, the crop production takes place in more or less family farms. That means family labor input is the dominant factor in doing the actual work. Again, this has a number of implications for the economic performance and the economic situation of farms, and that's what we track in our database. And the whole thing gets annually updated and regularly be reassessed to track changes in terms of rotations and stuff, so forth. And as I said, this whole work is being done by our partners together with regional advisors and growers. And we have developed a standard operating procedure for this. Once you have access to this presentation, you can check on these links, which will give you more detailed background information about what we are doing. Before I jump into the actual presentation, I would like to let you know, while I will be focusing here on crop production, AgriBenchmark also operates these branches in beef and sheep, in hog, in horticulture, and in aquaculture, which all follow the same principle, of course, with some slight modifications, but the whole procedure in terms of network and so forth will be the same. Yeah, now looking into canola. I have the first slide here is the map of typical farms which I have been using in order to prepare what I will present to you. And you can see that we have, where is it here? We have all the typical farms in Canada here involved. One of the farm from Ontario does not produce rapeseed, therefore it's not included here, but it will show up in the wheat part. Then we have like 3 typical farms in Russia. Maybe I should highlight the fact that our basic concept needs to be a little bit modified in Russia, given the situation in Russia. You probably are aware that, how should I say, that there's a very strong spread in performance, and we tend to have only access to more developed farms who are an interest, who have also the ability to provide those data to us which we need. Just a small side note, it's very well possible to get a complete list of the machinery of every farm in Russia or in Ukraine. They even have the number from which is printed into the machine. But when you ask them how much was the machine worth when you purchased it, they have to say, sorry, we don't track that. So that tells you a little bit about how many difficulties we have to overcome in order to include them. Okay, then we have the 3 farms in Argentina. Again, they don't produce any canola, but they produce wheat. I will be looking at that. Then we have 1 farm in Australia, and we have like 2 typical farms in Germany and 1 in France, and then another 3 US farms who are involved in wheat. Yeah. My whole presentation will be looking at basically 2 key cost elements. One is what we call direct cost, and I here illustrated to you what are the elements which are behind this category. And I thought it's easier to digest, to bundle all those costs into one item rather than to always display the whole detail list, because that will be hard for you to follow anyhow. And the other item we will be looking at is what we call operating cost. And again, I displayed here what are the key cost elements that are included here. And what I would like to highlight, because it's different from a normal P&L data sheet you will be aware of, is that we also value family labor. And that is in order to make the results comparable to hired farms based on hired labor, because in the long run, of course, the family labor is not for free. And we use the so-called opportunity cost approach, saying what would be the alternative income the family members would be able to generate outside the farm in order to evaluate their labor input to the farm business. Yeah, I think, and then all the other items here you are familiar with: contractor service, interest on machinery depreciation, repairs on fuel. So that's probably rather straightforward. Yeah, so this is now, the first graph. And as I said, I started with canola here. And the interesting thing, probably for most of you, it's not a big surprise to see that European farms tend to yield much higher than Canada. But on the other hand, you also have Australia here with slightly, or the Australian farm, I should say, with slightly below 1 ton. Since I averaged all the individual farms, I always indicate the variation of data, so give you a feel how strong is the variation within the various countries. Yeah, I think that's probably relatively straightforward. I should highlight, even though it's not included here, but what I mentioned here, if there is canola production in Russia, which is a small but very much growing crop, or even Kazakhstan, the yield level would be in a similar range as in Canada or even below that. So you're not the only country in the world with relatively low canola yields. So that's the first economic figure now. That's the direct cost in canola per hectare. I think that's very important. I always start with the perspective on per hectare because that's more easy for you to relate. At least that's what I hope. And then I always then convert that into per ton basis because that is in the end what counts. We're trading tons and not hectares, and therefore I think that's important for me to note. And what you can see here is on a per hectare basis, the Canadian farms in our comparison tend to be very relatively cheap compared to the Western European farms, but compared to Australia, it's relatively cost intensive. I should highlight the fact, I mean, you see it already by the average yield, the Australian crop production is more risky, I would say, than the Canadian one. They have on a regular basis complete crop failures, which I tend to understand is not that often in Canada, luckily enough. And this is then one detail I would like to highlight here, and that is the expenses farms have for seeds. So we, in Germany, for instance, our typical farms on average spend $75 per hectare on seeds, while in Canada, in our Canadian farms, it's about 130. I haven't looked at the details, but I guess that is partially compensated by lower herbicide costs because the bulk of the Canadian producer would use herbicide-resistant traits and have to pay an additional fee. But of course, in the first place, it increases seed cost, of course. So when now looking at the cost of production per ton, the picture changed dramatically. As far as direct costs are concerned, we have the situation that the German typical farm is the least cost producer on a direct cost basis, while the Canadian one and the Australian one are more on the higher end. This is a picture we will be seeing in wheat very similar, though so just indicate that now. And once again, I indicated here to you what are the cost of purchasing input which went into this calculation, and you can see that at least as part of that explanation is also that your nitrogen costs tend to be a little bit higher than in Germany. To be honest, I have no explanation for that, but maybe that's another discussion then afterwards. Now moving to operating costs, so machinery, labor, and contractor. In the first page, we have very much the same situation as in direct costs. The two Western European farms are way more expensive than both the Canadian and the Australian system. The interesting thing here, I would like to highlight here, that the German typical farms spend about $280 per hour for labor expenses, while in the Canadian system it's only 75. So it's very, very much lower than in Germany as far as the operation goes. But of course, the number of operations are also higher in Germany, which is partially an explanation of that, but only just a part. Yeah, and that's just to illustrate that these effects are not caused by strong difference in wage rates. So it's not that German farms spend $50 per hour, but rather they are on a pretty similar range as the Canadian producers in that comparison. So it's really a matter of efficiency of labor input and not a matter of prices or wage rates. Yeah, so now switching to the same perspective on a per ton basis, and now the system, the picture changes significantly. The Canadian producers really benefit from a very efficient operation management, both as far as labor is concerned, but also as far as machinery is concerned. It's about $50 less than the Western European competitors. Yeah. One other small aspect I wanted to highlight here is the issue of end productivity. I tend to believe that this is not a very familiar category for you, but I think in the view of the whole debate on greenhouse gas emissions, this might become a very interesting feature because, as you may know or may not know, nitrogen accounts for about 90% of all greenhouse gas emissions in crop production. So if there is a customer who cares for a relatively low greenhouse gas emission, nitrogen productivity will be one of the key factors determining this factor. And I would say from our database, one can assume that on average, the typical Canadian farm is about 15% better in terms of nitrogen productivity than the Western European peers. I put a question here. Is there some room for higher nitrogen input in the Canadian systems? That's probably something you then may discuss afterwards. I'm just raising the question from looking at the productivity figures. Yeah, so looking at the total of direct cost and operating cost on a per ton basis, as I said, that is what's being traded. Here, what is missing here is especially land cost and other cost. I will be talking about that in a minute in the wheat section. But what you can see here is that the Canadian producers in our comparison are the lowest cost producer on those two key cost items. What I should highlight here is that the prices, which is the red dot, sorry, I forgot to explain. So the blue bar is the sum of direct and operating costs. The red dot is marketing revenues, and I included the value for when you include direct payments, which are very important, as you can see here from in Western Europe, and convert that on a per ton basis. And what you can see here is that the Canadian producers tend to receive a slightly lower farm gate price. I sense that is basically driven by two factors. First of all, you have the relatively high burden of logistics costs to get the stuff shipped to the harbor, and also you are working on export parity both on the oil side and on the protein, while in Germany at least the protein part is based on import parity because we are a net importer of protein. So the relative price of the protein value of the protein content is a little bit higher than in Canada, I assume. Yeah, and as I said, last statement here, the importance of direct payments is really significant if you compare that to the rest of the crowd. Yeah, just one other look. We calculated what we call threshold prices. So that means the price you need to receive in order to continue producing, even if the price is not sufficient to cover total cost. Because that would be the decision-making rule if you're in a short-term perspective. Because every price which is above that price allows you to cover at least part of your fixed cost. And what you can see here is that basically, that basically roughly about $200 per ton is the threshold price across the board. That means even prices only slightly above that will lead producers to continue canola even if it's not covering total cost. Yeah, just a few conclusions regarding canola. The overall typical Canadian producer is very competitive. The strengths of Canadian farming systems are low operating costs due to high labor efficiency. The weaknesses, if you wish, is the direct cost, mainly due to high seed cost and relatively high nitrogen prices. The nitrogen productivity is relatively strong for the typical farms in Canada compared to the rest of the crowd. And the direct payments are very important for your producers. I should highlight, though, that in most European countries, the bulk of that value is then, of course, transferred into land rents, which are higher. I will talk about that in a minute when I talk about wheat. It's not the case for France. Yeah, so these were my thoughts and my data on canola. Now moving to wheat. I start the whole comparison. So now this time we have more countries involved because wheat is more widespread produced. And I start this whole comparison to put the figure more in perspective with a look at the precipitation of our typical farms they receive, because as you know, this is in most production systems the most limiting production factors nowadays. And what you can see here is that this is the Canadian farm, sorry, here. So it's the very similar level to Australia and the US, while all the other farms here, which we have from Russia, from France, from Germany, and from Argentina, are much higher in annual precipitation. And this is now the first picture looking at yields in our typical farms. And again, what you can see here is that Argentina, US, and Canada are on pretty much the same league at about 4 tons, 2.5 to 4 tons. Again, Australia is way below that with little less than 2 tons. Russia is somewhat in the middle with slightly above, at around 5 tons, while both France and Germany are in the range of 10 tons to the hectare. So that's, of course, a totally different story. What I would like to highlight here already is that when you recall the figure on precipitation, the Russian figure was about 100 millimeters more than the Canadian and the US system, but the yield is only slightly higher. So I think that that's one indicator that those systems do not fully exploit the yield potential that they have. Yeah, so again, short look at the direct cost on a per hectare basis. Similar picture basically as we have seen in the case of rapeseed. German and French farms spend about 500 to almost 600 bucks on a per hectare basis, while Argentina, Canada, and the US are in the range of 300, 250 to 300. Russia and Australia are even below 200 bucks on a per hectare basis. Just to give you an indication what intensity is behind those figures, the Canadian system and the Russian system are on a similar level with about 90 kgs per hectare, while the German farm, similar figure would be true for the French farm, operate at roughly 200 kgs per hectare. So that's, of course, one of the reasons why yields are so different. So when we convert that to direct cost per ton, the change is in principle similar as we have seen it in the rapeseed case. The kind of low yielding systems tend to be more expensive on a per ton basis when compared to the high intensive systems. What we have to highlight though is that especially in Germany and France, this high intensity in fertilizer use is combined with also very high intensity in crop protection expenditure. In particular, fungicide applications are in a similar range or even be above what they spend on herbicide applications. So they would usually go like 3 to 4 times for herbicide for fungicide application. So just a combination of high intensity in fertilization plus a very sophisticated and intensive crop protection system enables them to fully exploit the biological potential of those sites. Yeah, and again, I've been looking at what were the input prices, and when you look at what the Russian farms had to spend on fertilizer, it becomes obvious that this is one of the key drivers why they are so damn competitive in terms of direct costs, because they basically only have to spend half of what you guys and also the Western European farms have to spend for nitrogen. So a quick look at the operating cost again. I directly switched to the per ton perspective. And again, we have the situation that, no, it's slightly different here. The key statement here is that the Argentine system is very, very competitive on a per hectare, on a per ton basis. And the key driver here is that everything what is actually done on the farm is done through contract service. So you only pay for what you actually use. It's a very competitive situation. We would have the same picture when we would be looking at corn or soybeans. It's across the board. Yeah. Somehow the system is... and I would like to highlight the look at the wage rates, and this is another factor here. What you can see is that the Canadian producers spend about $25 per hour, while the Russian farms only spend $3 per hour. But the interesting thing is, though, that on a per ton basis, labor cost is basically the same. So that means the Canadian farm spends about $11 per ton on labor, while the Russian farms spend $9.4 per ton. What it tells us is that obviously labor productivity is extremely low in Russia or extremely high in Canada. And for those of you who have some experience in Russia, may know that they spend a lot of people in just securing machinery against theft. In some cases, they even guard the harvest in order to protect from theft. Then they have a huge bureaucracy running around and so forth. So that is no big surprise to me. But of course, when you look at the figures, it's very surprising. Land lease cost on a per ton basis, that is an interesting thing. I think that even though you may think, okay, our land prices are low, but if you compare it on a per ton basis, that is not necessarily true. What is definitely true is that the Russian system is very, very cheap. This only reflects the fact that the competition for land is far, far less than in all the developed countries we compare it here. And the interesting thing is that even though the domestic prices are so depressed in Argentina, still the cost of land per ton are very high. I should highlight here that the French figure tends to be a little bit skewed, and that is simply because there is a legislation in place in France which limits officially the land rents which can be traded. However, one has to assume that there is some payment under the table, simply because you need to keep in mind that the producers receive something in the range of $350 per hectare on direct payments. That means this figure would imply that it would be very, very much attractive to just rent land and let it idle because it's so cheap. Yeah, so now looking at direct operating and other costs versus market revenue and decoupled payments. So I explained to you the figures already before. The difference is that I now also included other costs here. And the interesting finding is that typical Russian and Argentine farms on a per ton basis in wheat are very competitive. However, I should highlight that the Argentine system for this year's were not able to cover total cost in that comparison. And the other thing which I should highlight also is that the Russian system is also faced with very low farm gate prices. Again, it's something in the range of $50 below the rest of the crowd. I will talk about that. The Argentine farm gate prices are very much depressed due to both export taxes and also occasionally bans of exports. So that means everyone who is involved in wheat trading is faced with the risk that the very next day the government may say, oh, sorry, no export allowed anymore, and therefore they only trade wheat at a very severe discount. What I should highlight, though, is if you recall the figures I showed you on the land lease cost, if you add this to those figures here, you would see that most of the farms would be struggling covering total costs. So that gives you an indication that there is already nowadays a certain pressure on those production systems to cover total cost. Yeah, sorry. So when you look at this figure for Russia and compare this to the rest of the crowd, this tells you that our Russian farms are, as I said in the very beginning, are very, very competitive, and therefore I added one slide, and that is looking at the evolution of Russian wheat exports, and I calculated the annual increase, and it's about 14% per year over this 15 years or so. So that gives you a flavor of their strengths, and I think our figures clearly indicate where that's coming from. Yeah, so far about wheat. Yes, a few conclusions. Overall, typical Canadian farms are doing well in cost of production, but not as strong as in canola. Farms in Argentina and Russia are significantly better. The strengths, again, for the typical Canadian farms, a low operating cost due to high efficiency on a per ton basis, comparable to Russian farms, despite the 8 times higher wage rates. Weakness, as in canola, in the Canadian system are the direct cost. Even German growers with more than 2 times higher nitrogen input produce at a lower direct cost. And you really need out to the Russia and wheat market. Despite an ongoing growth in yields, so over the last decade they had about 1 to 2% per year, I think there is still significant room for higher yields in Russia. So I would assume that their growth and output will continue for the next years to come. So that leads me also to the conclusion that I would consider, at least as far as agronomical possible, also to explore options to look at more demanding and high value crops, because that's one of the weaknesses of the Russian system due to the size of the farms and due to the lack of expertise and know-how. Whenever it comes to a very sophisticated production system with more advanced requirements regarding management, they will be running into trouble. And I consider you guys to be very strong in those issues, so I would consider looking at alternative crops, for instance, as the pulses, which are, I understand, relatively hard to manage. Yeah, just another elephant in the room, Argentina. First of all, you may recall this trend in the evolution of wheat trade. So back in 2013-14, they were basically non-existing on global wheat markets. It recovered slightly in recent years, but I think there's good reason to assume that this will even continue, that they will recover, because as you probably have all heard about, the Argentine government decided to quit the export taxes on wheat and to phasing out the export taxes on the other product. but the wheat immediately gets the benefit from that political change, and I will try to explore a little bit what might mean. Just in the indication how strong this impact from this distortion of prices was. So while the other products went up by about 50% or more, these are even several 100% in soybeans, the wheat acreage went down, and that was because of the fact which I explained to you before. This is one scenario calculation for one of our typical farms in Argentina. And they have basically like 3 different cropping options. One is to have soybean as the main crop. The other one is to have a combination of wheat and soybean, so a late soybean and a wheat crop. And then they can also go for just corn. And if you see the blue bar here is the situation in 2015. So that indicates why we have seen such a very strong increase in soybean acreage, in soybean production, and only a very small decrease in the very poor development in wheat and also corn. And if you compare that to the scenario calculation for 2020, you see that the wheat-soy system will be by far the most competitive system. And this is why I think we have to assume that they will boost significantly their their wheat production. Yeah, that's the prognosis from our partners in Argentina. Conclusions: I think the initial change in ag trade policy will significantly raise farm gate prices in general in Argentina, but particular in wheat. Due to non-tariff interventions in wheat, the price increase will be much stronger than the percentage change in export tariff would suggest. And I think we have to assume strong increases in wheat acreage and yields. Since domestic prices will go up, export will grow even stronger. And as I said, Argentina is most likely to become an important player on global markets again. So, thank you for your attention. I'm looking forward to receiving your questions and comments. Too much information?
The very early slide there, average rainfall in Canada, was that millimeters? What was that?
Yes.
You were looking at 400 millimeters?
Yes, millimeters.
So that takes into, you've got what, you've got 2 or 3 Western farms and 1 Eastern?
We got 2 from Ontario, 2 from Manitoba, and 2 from Saskatchewan.
Okay, thank you.
Your nitrogen cost
for
your European farmers substantially lower than nitrogen cost for Western Canadian farmers, where we have natural gas and a large number of fertilizer plants. And any ideas why that cost is different besides the fact that the price is dictated because they can?
To be honest, no. I tend to believe that until recently, Canada was also a net importer in nitrogen. Is that true? So that might be one explanation, and then you have to ship it all the way to your farms. That might be one element for the explanation. Yeah. Other than that, I don't have an explanation for that. Okay, yeah, I mean, whenever you have further questions, I mean, I will be around for the rest of the afternoon, or you can contact me through the email which is indicated in my presentation. So once again, thank you for your interest, and see you. Bye.